and welcome to our virtual College of Liberal Arts Faculty Colloquium. My name is Erska Dobrsek, and I'm coordinator of this speaking series. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kristalyn Shefveland. Dr. Shefveland is an associate professor of history, author of Anglo-Native Virginia, Trade Conversation, and Indian Slavery in the Old Dominion, 1646 through 1722. It was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2017. She also published numerous articles on Native America and the American South and the Atlantic world. Her research has been presented at national and international conferences in the fields of early America, ethnohistory, and Native American or indigenous studies. Dr. Shefveland is a co-creator of the Ellen Morris Forum on the Native South. And today's presentation relates to the research for a forthcoming book, Old Florida, Yankee Settler Colonialism in the Land of the Ace and Seminole, and an article for the Western Historical Quarterly.
I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to present this and the opportunity to talk to you. And of course, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that where we are here in Evansville, Indiana, is contested ground of many Native peoples who lay claim to this region, and that we should always be mindful and respectful of descendant communities that came from these regions. And so Pocahontas and settler memory. For nearly 25 years in rural Hinds County, Mississippi, there stood a large Western Plains style teepee. It was part of a local barbecue joint outside the unincorporated town of Pocahontas. The structure, complete with a Thunderbird mural, existed near the Pocahontas Indian mounds until the community tore the teepee down in 2016 to make room for a Dollar General store. In central Arkansas, the city of Pocahontas displays a statue of their namesake in their Overlook Park near the banks of the Black River. Intriguingly, no northeastern towns bear the name Pocahontas, but plenty of Yankee settlers of the South, Midwest, and West chose that name for their settlements. Other small towns named Pocahontas exist in Alabama, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. Pocahontas, Oregon, a short-lived mining settlement, boomed and busted in the 1860s Powder River region, while a gold mine called Pocahontas was part of El Dorado, California. Today, I want to talk about two places named for Pocahontas in the late 19th century, a coal region and a farming settlement. The Pocahontas Coalfield, a 900 square mile section of Western Virginia, West Virginia, and Eastern Kentucky, inspired the naming of another short-lived coalfield settlement in Alberta, Canada, near what is now the Jasper National Park. And the second area I'd like to talk about is in coastal Vero Beach, Florida, where a large Spanish mission-style building with a carving of Pocahontas cradling a basket overlooks the town center along Osceola Boulevard, perhaps one of the strangest mashups of settler colonial romance. In that it seems like Sacagawea has merged with Pocahontas and to carry Pompey, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, into the nation's embrace. Though far in space and time from the native Pamunkey homelands along the Tidewater in what is now Virginia, these towns and mining regions named Pocahontas remain fertile sites for investigating her legacy and the ways in which her story and identity are used to promote development and construct American settler identity. While scholars of the contact era and the indigenous world have sought to understand both the English and the Pamunkey perspective on the woman alternatively known as Amunute, Matoaka, Pocahontas, and lastly, Rebecca Rolfe, settlers and popular media have claimed ownership of the Pocahontas narrative in order to support American growth and expansion. The contest over the meaning and memory of Pocahontas illustrates how town developers and settlers used memorialization to justify territorial acquisition and Anglo-American development while crafting a new fantastical narrative of colonization in the years following the Civil War. I am utilizing the Pocahontas Coalfields in West Virginia and the Indian River Farms Company settlement of Vero Beach, Florida, as case studies of settler memory in two very different but connected southern spaces that settlers considered frontiers as late as the 19th century. Both places constructed fantasies about Native peoples that promulgated enduring tropes that focused primarily on the idea of the Native woman, Pocahontas. These are imaginative creations that both attempt to create a settlement and to hearken back to fantasies of the past that never fully existed. With selective constructions of memory, both settlements chose Pocahontas because the name evoked a settler dream of a good Indian yielding to conquest as they sought a pliant and willing landscape that would yield mineral and agricultural riches. Yet both places have longer and deeper Native histories that settler and booster histories have obfuscated and hidden in favor of the more romantic national narratives, such as the Pocahontas myth, in order to sell a place and to sell a product. Fetishization of Native peoples has long been a hallmark of settler histories and memory. And the colonial era provides a blueprint for settler production of memory in both the New England colonies and the Chesapeake. Settlers deployed and transformed the memories of Indigenous people for similar purposes. For example, Washington Irving, in his work on Native people, created and deployed various settlement and encounter myths in the 19th century. The violence of the colonial era can be seen in the settler reimaginings of Metacom or King Philip, the subject of many popular 19th century plays and poems. As Jill Lepore has found, Indians emerge in histories in ways that are, quote, cherished, romanticized, and fetished. Yet importantly, these roles are only present as a settler artifact of a distant past, where Indians themselves must exist only in the past, mute memorials, silent as a rock. Either that or else they could be far, far away, exiled west of the Mississippi. Richard Slotkin's work on the myth of the frontier expounds further upon this, whereby, quote, a historical sequence is infused with meaning in the form of a story, which converts landscape to symbol and temporal sequence into doom, a fable of necessary and fated actions. Myths are stories drawn from history that have acquired through usage over many generations a symbolizing function that is central to the cultural functioning of the society that produces them. A few recurrent themes emerge in settler memories and naming practices in expansion and the memorialization of conquest stories. To begin with, these towns are part of a larger settler tradition of removal and erasure. They obfuscate the Native history of these regions by replacing the elements that settlers wanted to forget with national narratives that they viewed to be, quote, romantic. And they create a mixed bag of stereotypes, often playing upon the trope of the good Indian and the noble savage, but they also reflect gendered conceptions of land and Indigenous peoples, and rarely reflect any of the legitimate history of Pocahontas or the encounter period. This act of habitual settler memory is one that Kevin Brunel argues is an act that legitimizes the status and persistence of American liberal colonialism and US state practices. They remain fertile sites for investigating the legacy of Pocahontas and the ways in which her story and identity are used to promote development and construct American identity in these new, predominantly frontier towns. In many of these regions, there are much longer histories of Native settlements and oftentimes violent encounters with settlers. Certainly this was the case for the Pocahontas Coalfield, once the site of a Native palisaded town until the 17th century, and the site of many armed conflicts with settlers in the Shawnee, and for the Indian River settlements in Florida, from the very first European encounter with the Spanish and with the Ais in the 15th century, all the way to the Seminole Wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But for these settlers, Pocahontas exists as a global icon. myth stripped of any historical fact, an icon that settlers can utilize with almost brand familiarity as Pocahontas becomes America's Indian. As literary scholar Philip Young noted, she is shop-worn by sentimentality. Pocahontas endures and stands with the most appealing of our saints. She has passed subtly into our folklore, where she lives as a popular fable, a parable taught to children who carry some vague memory of her through their lives. The treatments of Pocahontas fall into patterns, dramatizing the story from the alleged facts and filling gaps or inadequacies with invented material, usually presented as fact. And settlers took advantage of public fascination with Pocahontas to lay claim to so-called virgin territories, while physically dispossessing Native peoples from their land and writing settler histories that bolster the American myth of settler innocence. Through plays, poems, advertisements, and architecture, one can see the creation of this American myth and the claiming of Pocahontas as the model of what Raina Green has called the Pocahontas perplex, a system of the good Indian princess. Green calls her a mother figure, exotic, powerful, dangerous, and beautiful, and a representation of American liberty and European classical virtue translated into New World terms. Now, the Pocahontas narrative has been repeatedly manipulated by each successive American generation. Early settler narratives focused on her marriage to John Rolfe and the importance of her conversion. And in the 19th century, they shifted and placed an emphasis on the rescue of John Smith, emphasizing her role as the savior of the Virginia colony. And so at some point, the historical figure of Pocahontas herself becomes this legendary character that is used by settlers to suit their needs in creating this national myth. In the case of memorials, a physical reminder of their right to claim Indigenous land and space because Pocahontas had offered herself up, allegedly, to the English. This is what Phil Deloria has described as one of the two contradictory engendered storylines of Native history. In the case of Pocahontas, she has been linked to the land itself, he says, engendering a peaceful narrative of cross-cultural harmony in which whites became Indigenous owners of the continent through sexualized love and marriage stories. The second set of stories, I should note, relied upon violent conflict and masculinity, which were certainly present in the narratives of the contact era conflicts with Shawnee peoples in the Ohio Valley and in the South with Native Floridians. As a scholar of memory and the American West, David Robel notes, we must consider the construction of memory and how memories are not merely recollected or reproduced, but at times even invented. This is a narrative that we tend to associate with pioneers and with the West, but it happens in the South as well, from the settlement of Florida to the coalfields of Appalachia. Often these were New South projects, where boosters selected national memories as they sought to block out the Southern history that they didn't want to talk about, that they wanted to forget. Settlers of the West and Florida have both selectively created memories that highlight the stories and events that they wanted to remember. Pioneer reminiscence, Robel notes, like the promotional literature, can be most profitably used as a mirror to reflect the outlook of those doing the reminiscing, rather than as a clear window on the actual events that are described between the covers of their accounts. So in the two case sites that I'd like to talk a little bit more about now, the reminiscing is also part of a larger booster campaign to root the sites as connected to a mythical and Indigenous and settler past, and to legitimize settler claims to the region. The successful late 19th century settlement of the Pocahontas Coalfield was a commercial Yankee endeavor from day one, spurred by the Norfolk and Western Railroad's interest in the region. From 1880 to 1930, in southern West Virginia alone, 100 mining towns developed along with 220 mining operations. The Pocahontas Coalfield is 900 square miles in the Appalachian Allegheny Plateau, with its center about 100 miles southeast from Charleston, West Virginia. 130 miles west from Roanoke, Virginia, and more than 300 miles west of Jamestown, Virginia. Prior to European settlement, there was a palisaded native village in the region. It is now known as the Crab Orchard Archaeological Site near Pisgah, Virginia, on the Clinch River. And in Tazewell County, native occupation of the site dates to about 1400 Common Era. I'm going to skip over a lot of discussion of Monacan and Shawnee occupation and the longer history with settlers. So I would like to focus more on how they're utilizing Pocahontas, but understand that there are hundreds and hundreds of years of contact and stories. But for nearly 100 years, towards the end of the colonial endeavor and near to the early republic, most of the coalfield legally belonged to the descendants of colonial soldiers, veterans of the 7 Years' War and Revolutionary Wars, who the Virginia government had granted land for their service, but since ownership required proper surveying, patenting, and taxes, many sold their land grants to speculators and landed gentry such as George Washington, whose descendants then still controlled the region, and the remote and largely unsettled terrain was open for a century. Founding settlers of the region fought for several decades to push further into lands inhabited by descendant Monacan, Shawnee, Cherokee, Wyandot, Mingo, and Delaware, as settlers dispossessed Indian lands in the Appalachians and the river valleys of the Allegheny in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. More settlers moved into the region around the Civil War, including one Jordan Nelson to Powell's Bottom, where he found a sizable outcropping of coal on a nearby hill and began to dig chunks of it suitable for fueling his home fireplace and blacksmith forge. Nelson found himself on the richest seam in coal history, or in American coal history, what would one day be called the Pocahontas No. 3 mine. I'd like to point out how big was this seam. In some places, over 6 feet tall, in some places as high as 10 feet tall. It stretched all the way from Pennsylvania down into Alabama. Officially a town with the opening of a post office on June 30th, 1882, the town needed a name that would inspire investment and settlement. Within an era of bombastic settler histories of the past, new settlements sought to connect nostalgia for the first encounters and present a nationalist tone that championed white settlement. Instead of connecting to violent histories or framing the town within the history of white settlers and the themes of rugged individualism by celebrating men like Daniel Boone, the Yankee settlers sought instead to choose a native name, stripped of all its original history, the quote-unquote beautiful and romantic name, Pocahontas. Most sources agree that it was Mrs. Harriet Lathrop, the wife of mine superintendent William Lathrop, that likely picked the name for its quote-unquote picturesque qualities. The settlement of Pocahontas quickly grew into a bustling mining town that chroniclers have connected less to the history of the South and more to stereotypes of the Wild West, at a wild and woolly reputation. Company officials were desperately in need of adequate labor in the isolated settlement, and so they tolerated a measure of lawlessness in exchange. As a fabled center of coalfield entertainment, they had a bawdy saloon culture, sporting dozens of watering holes, and liquor was freely dispensed by the drink on the street. Pocahontas' story, according to one scholar, was frontier Americana. Residents named the rougher areas of town Hell's Half Acre, where payday Saturday nights often ended in violence, almost like a Wild West town, one memory recalls. Certain rougher members of the community gambled, played cards, shot crap, danced, and raised Hades in the saloons. At one time, there were 27 watering holes operating illegally since Tazewell County was dry. In 1890, Pocahontas boasted a population of 2,593 with at least 45 saloons and combination saloons and houses of prostitution. On the eastern edges of the coalfields, local laborers, including some native Monacan, entered the coalfields as workers in order to earn funds to support their subsistence farming and pay taxes on their farms. Local laborers, however, did not provide nearly enough manpower for the expanding mines, and coal operators sought to bring in sources of non-local laborers. African-American laborers moved to the region and recent Eastern European immigrants as well, providing a steady source of labor as coal companies sent bilingual agents to New York and Ellis Island to gather up recent arrivals coming from coal-producing regions of Europe and what are now the countries of Poland, Russia, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. The town of Pocahontas had nearly 2,000 Hungarian immigrants by the early 20th century. Coal laborers, though, faced harsh working conditions extracting the coal, evident in the March 13th, 1884 mine disaster that claimed 184 lives, including 15 African Americans and 40 Hungarians. While remarkably dangerous, though, the coalfields were quite productive and lucrative during this period. By 1900, the Pocahontas coalfields were yielding 7 million tons of coal. By 1910, that amount grew to 17 million. By this time, operators formed the Pocahontas Operators Association, a powerful lobbying, promotion, and public relations organization that energetically utilized Native American Indian advertising schemes to place, quote unquote, Princess Pocahontas across the land. Stock of the Pocahontas Consolidated Collieries Company Incorporated included a stylized and fantastical engraving of the Pocahontas saving John Smith from her father Powhatan, complete with a vaguely Plains Indian garb. Other companies included Shawnee Coal and Coke and the Hiawatha Coal and Coke Company as well, with engravings of Native men in elaborate feather headdresses. Pocahontas occupied the bulk of the advertising materials for the coalfield boosters, promotional literature and adverts for commercial and household use of Pocahontas coal focused on Pocahontas in a dress, draping off her exposed shoulder, very reminiscent of the 1839 John Gadsby Chapman painting, The Baptism of Pocahontas, and this is in the United States Capitol Rotunda. But this image that they utilize has the added elements of a sheaf of arrows and a feathered headdress. In these images, Pocahontas is both virginal and almost coquettish. She has slightly rouged cheeks, rosebud lips, and she looks almost like a silent film star. Later, the Pocahontas Exhibition Mine published a comic souvenir in the 1940s, The Exciting True Adventures of Pocahontas, whose covers depict a swashbuckling and dashing white hero killing a native man with a mohawk, while Pocahontas is in a fringe leather dress inhabiting the background with a shocked expression on her face, a damsel in distress. Says clearly on the front, "You have visited one of the most interesting spots in the South, the exhibition mine of Pocahontas, Virginia. The Pocahontas Fuel Company encouraged its readers to read the thrilling life story of Pocahontas while learning facts about Pocahontas coal. Included with the facts was that coal is the master key to the production of all weapons of war." Pocahontas, I should note, plays a very limited role in the series included in the comic. Most of the focus is on stereotypical renditions of white settler heroes vanquishing native foes over the contest of land. Like the creators of mine towns in the Pocahontas coalfield, Florida settlers and boosters of the Indian River Farms Company borrowed heavily from native names and imagery, revealing a similar set of goals for settler communities in the South. Vero has a long indigenous past. Human settlement in Florida and the Indian River Lagoon date back to at least 13 to 14,000 years ago, and there's a large debate about whether or not it's even longer than that. Large-scale white settlement, though, would not find a successful foothold in South Florida until after the Civil War. Residents of the northern United States, calling themselves pioneers and colonizers, moved to the Indian River in waves throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. There, they built empires of citrus and sugar. The Indian River Farms Company of Davenport, Iowa, made some of the greatest strides towards conquering and reimagining La Florida. While beginning to settle the region in the 1880s, the company created this romantic narrative, to sell land to potential northern colonizers using names that they considered picturesque. Herman J. Zook was the principal propagandist and organizer of this endeavor, and he stood to gain the most. The company began in September 1912 with an initial settlement purchase of 48,000 acres, which expanded to 55,000 later that year. Most of the land, purchased at the bargain price of $3 an acre, was underwater. Thus, the company first focused on dredging out a drainage canal into the Indian River north of the proposed sites. Once these wetlands were reclaimed, the company offered them at $150 to $200 an acre. Now, this endeavor was not Zook's first foray into settler development. He had been an insurance agent in Denver. He had stakes in the settlement of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I should note, though, anyone who has actually spent time in the prairie or the mountains in the winter might be able to understand why he would be so interested in going south. All joking aside, the business block that Zook and others planned for downtown Vero was designed in a fanciful vision of Spanish colonization, one that they hoped would be on par with the new architecture for St. Augustine and Tampa. P.T. Burroughs and Charles Grilk, Davenport architects, sought to meet the requirements of a semi-tropical climate and at the same time harmonize with the surroundings. They felt that Florida had been indifferent to building attractive settlements. And they said when the people of Florida began to pay as much attention to the appearance of their buildings and environs as is done in California, a trip through Florida will be as great a delight to the eye as is presented by the Western state. So what's happening here is the architects of Vero and other Florida cities notice how popular California is. They're fighting over citrus, but they're also fighting over how beautiful the mission sites were. And so they want to recreate a Spanish environment, a colonial Spanish environment. And so in many cases, they're actually copying directly from California. The building that I'm interested in to talk about in this colonial memory project is a strange fusion of this romanticized mission past with a relief of Pocahontas on its second story. The Pocahontas building, built in 1923, was originally just a simple one-story city block, only vaguely Spanish in its original construction. In May 1926, though, the second story was added, along with 23 efficiency kitchenette apartments of the most modern type, with the most interesting thing, one news report noted, was the modeling in cement of a life-size Pocahontas. By September of 1926, this building was complete and decidedly more Spanish mission style in its final version, with elements of the revival architecture inspired by Moorish and Mediterranean traditions. And all the way at the top, you can also see the bird that is actually related to the Rolfe family crest. So lots of little details here. The Pocahontas Coalfields make sense. It's in Virginia. It's far from Jamestown, but naming the settlement for Pocahontas in Virginia makes sense. Other buildings in Vero Beach, given the developer's Midwestern origin, a Sleepy Eye Lodge named after a Dakota leader, makes sense. The inclusion of a Seminole building in Osceola Boulevard, as well as the 1926 Pueblo Arcade, are also logical inclusions to a town with a distant Spanish past for boosters seeking to create an investment opportunity for new pioneers. But why was the Algonquin Virginian Pocahontas chosen as the name for their headquarters? As mentioned earlier, again, while scholars of the contact period are seeking to understand the role of Indigenous women and their societies and their importance as cultural mediators, it is also crucial to understand what boosters and settlers thought Pocahontas represented, and how these settlers used Native women as a justification for their conquest and settlement of the Indian River region. And so the Improved Order of the Red Men was a very popular fraternal organization for many of the Midwestern settlers of Florida. In 1885, the Ladies Auxiliary of the Improved Order organized chapters of the degree of Pocahontas throughout the country. Like the misuse of Native names and symbols by the Boy Scouts in many US summer camps to this day, these fraternal organizations had no connection to Indigenous people whatsoever. They were merely inspired by and patterned after their often erroneous understandings of Indigenous beliefs and ceremonies. The example of Pocahontas, described by these American settlers, was one of grace, beauty, and virtue, as well as constant friendship to the palefaces. She was a woman of remarkable grace, beauty, and kindness of heart, they write, whose assistance to the English settlers ultimately allowed the English colony to grow and flourish. In the official history of the organization, I should note, was published first in 1892, there is a poem that includes the following lines. As Pocahontas, while these skies remain, still our zodiac show the virgin sign. But as Rebecca, when yon stars shall wane, yon heavens roll by, she is a star, shall shine. Her growth and her importance is as a convert. Her growth and her importance are about her giving up her Indigenous identity. The cultural memory and myths surrounding the importance of Indigenous women allows some insight into settler construction of justified conquest and settlement of territory. The story of Pocahontas in particular illustrates the importance of Native conversion to US settler narratives as she turned away from her Indigenous beliefs to embrace the English both figuratively and literally. She represents to settlers a promise of motherhood, of fertility, of a gentle hand of women and domesticity to flower their fields of settlement. In short, Pocahontas represents to these Florida settlers a perfectly good Indian to juxtapose in a building physically adjacent to the doomed noble savage they represent through Osceola. Statues of Pocahontas played into a post-Civil War sentimentality about US settler colonialism. Settlers and scholars of memory have discussed the important differences between collective memory and history. While history presents a neatly packaged version of past events, memory is an untidy process in which a mythical narrative is constantly negotiated. It has long been the tradition that in schools throughout America, elementary teachers focus on moral stories about past American heroes who struggled to create a national identity, forge and articulate enduring national ideals, while promoting American values and Native history is often relegated to themes of inevitable demise. This process can be tied back to the professionalization of history in the Gilded Age and the response Americans had to the dawning of the new century. Through commemoration, social clubs, and popular culture, Americans of this era were often reacting against the influx of new immigrants, rapidly industrializing cities, and sought to create a connection to a uniquely American past while setting the stage for further development in places to the west and to the south. In this way, the founders of the Pocahontas Coalfields and Vero Beach, Florida, were projecting their visions of the future by crafting an idealized past, a process that creates two very different types of histories, that of facts and that of interpretation of those facts. The myth of this Anglo-Indian encounter in the Chesapeake was of such deep importance to architects because it is a cherished national myth. Pocahontas plays the role of a founding mother in the American South and in the Midwest. For the settlers and architects, this is an example of the mythical colonial past that these boosters and these settlers thought picturesque for their advertising journal. But it is also a myth rooted in a national Anglo identity of the Algonquin woman nicknamed Pocahontas. They utilized her as a clear example of the good Indian as they sought to expand their territories and to create this narrative. At the same time, their use of Pocahontas as a trope erases Native peoples and their histories from the past and the present with a mythology that belies the more complicated truth. Late 19th century stories are a continuation of a longer history of colonial myths and legends that become rooted in early American literatures. In Florida, These attitudes allow for a continued disavowal of Seminole claims to the region by ignoring migration patterns and connections to older indigenous communities of the peninsula, opting instead for narratives of a fancy, a Eden-like past of old Florida, which is a simplistic take on the real natural Florida that boosters of the colonial period conjured up for trade companies and investment. Erased in these narratives are the all too human worlds of the native ice and their violent encounters with the Spaniards and the aggressive American expansionism into Florida in the 19th century and into the 20th century. In the coalfields of the Allegheny Mountains, historic preservation groups have sought to remember the settlers that the Shawnee attacked while seeking to protect the legacy of the Pocahontas coal mines amid a rapidly diminishing population, an act of holding on to an industrial past while trying to create a tourist site and future for a faltering town and inhabiting the myth of settler innocence. This plays directly into memorialization projects throughout the United States that valorize settler pioneers. Thank you.
And we do have a question from Dr. Tamara Hunt. Was there any pushback in the early 20th century to using the images and the legend of Pocahontas by Indians or historians who presumably knew better? There's a follow-up question on that. Do we know what contemporary Native people thought of these images and the myth itself?
Absolutely. So we really only start to see with the new social history of the 60s and 70s and the development of fields like Indian studies, like ethnohistory, and individuals like Raina Green, who start to really talk about and to push back on this idea. So in the early 20th century, this is not something that really pops up in the scholarship or is really an area of focus for Indigenous scholars.
From Dr. Jason Hargrave, where is the line between honoring and remembering Native culture by non-natives and cultural appropriation?
That's an excellent question. And so I would say it's very much dependent on the communities in which you're speaking with. And so there is no one blanket statement that will work for all of the various groups. So I would recommend there are so many cultural resource officers that are actively working with the public and are very happy to provide education opportunities. And so when we talk about memorialization projects, it's going to run the gamut. And so I would really recommend go to the individual tribes, talk to their cultural resource officers, because everybody's going to be doing their own things because they are their own individual communities.
What about Native peoples? Is there anything in their traditions that denounce these images and ideas?
Well, part of the pushback, especially about Pocahontas, is to make sure that her story is known. So there are a couple of really interesting oral traditions that come out of Virginia to talk about what happened and the very dark history of what actually happened to Pocahontas when she was taken captive. After the Mattaponi broke from the Pamunkey during the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. And so the biggest pushback, Tamara, is to talk about the story and to try to move away from the sort of Disneyfication of the woman Pocahontas. I had the opportunity to present in England on the anniversary of her death. And there was a huge contingent of Pamunkey peoples that came over. And part of their focus is to make sure to visit her gravesite and to be able to continue that story and to tell the truth about what happened to her.
I believe this is a follow-up question from Dr. Hargrave. Are there instances where Native groups have copyrighted their own images, names, and so on, and used them or profited by them themselves?
Yes. Florida State, and it has an agreement with us with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I will note that the Seminole Tribe of Oklahoma does not agree with the use of Osceola, but the Florida state has very strict rules set forth by the Seminole tribe of how they are allowed to use the image of Osceola. And again, individual tribes make decisions with people about mascots, with people about memorialization and with stories. And that's why I say, you know, go to the tribes and talk to their cultural resource officer, because it's not a one size fits all situation.
What do you believe is the best way to touch on subjects such as these with younger individuals, such as, for example, high school students?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think you should tell the truth. And so I would not get into all of the more difficult elements. You know, you don't need to get into the more macabre and gruesome elements, but you can talk about the fact that she was a captive. And you can talk about the fact that it is very likely that she did not save John Smith, and that this is something that is up to a lot of contestation. And so you could talk about why John Smith was writing that story and why he was synthesizing stories of being saved. He was saved in Eastern Europe by a princess as well, allegedly. And that's something that you could focus on. But I would be very clear in talking about how Pocahontas is one of the very first examples of being a captive, and how that leads to legacies of captivity and abuse of Native women. And it directly leads to the missing and murdered Indigenous women that are such a huge problem to this day.
What interested you to become a historian, and perhaps more specifically, what interested you in the work that you do?
Absolutely. So I come from a long line of storytellers, and I come from Wabasha, Minnesota, which is at the very heart of issues between settlers and Dakota peoples. And so I grew up with these stories, and I also grew up with an understanding of Native stereotypes and what was happening in settler histories. And so I was always fascinated by it. And I thought I was going south to study peoples different than where I came from. And I ended up studying peoples that had migrated out of the Great Lakes into the South. And I became interested in the Pocahontas building for this research project because my family lives there. And seeing this building, I had to know, why is Pocahontas on this Spanish mission style building in the heart of Vero Beach? And that, you know, has become this new research project.
We have another question from Robert. What book would you recommend for the real history of Pocahontas?
So there's an oral history by the Mattaponi that I would recommend that talks about oral traditions. So if you were to look up Mattaponi oral history, that you would be able to find it. It's readily available in libraries to interlibrary loan, and it's pretty affordable on book sites online as well.
So Dr. Shefveland, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation on Pocahontas, and thank you for attending this session.